Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Idan Aronson from Merged. We just finished our season one, but we decided to do a special recording for Christmas and the holidays. And I have here Dominik. Um,
Hi.
Dominik is known for TanStack, which is a cross-library, cross-framework uh, JavaScript, spans JavaScript libraries brand, I can say, or like house. Um, and today I'm going to learn a little about what he's doing more deeply. Yeah, Dominik, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm good. Hello. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Um, Thank you for coming. So I know React Query for quite a while. Now it's not React Query anymore, right? It's like
Exactly, yeah. So,
TanStack Query. So maybe
TenStack
that,
Query.
yeah, maybe that's my first question is like, what's with the brand name?
What the brand name is? Yeah, so the TenStack was made by Tanner Linsley. And I think he got that brand name somehow from Twitter when it was suggested to him that because his name is Tanner, he could like the things that he builds, all the open source libraries, it could become the TanStack because it also rhymes with Jamstack, and it's kind of cool. And he started to roll with it, and he got the domain tanstack.com. And then there were like the first libraries were I think like React Table and React Query then obviously, and then some others that are not that much known. I think React Charts is also quite well known, I guess. And then React Router, something that he's currently working on, a new routing solution. Yeah, and the TenStack kind of got quite popular also with the name. But the idea to, at least for the query part of the TenStack, to actually be framework agnostic, so to not be dependent on React and also get React out of the name. It happened this year, but I think it actually started like some time ago when the code was structured in a way to not have dependencies on React in the main part, in the core package. It was just not released separately as an independent library. But even with React Query version 3, we have seen some people that knew that there was a framework agnostic core inside of it, and they started to build adapters separately depending on the query core. And so libraries like Vue Query were born. They were just not, I don't think they had that much attention at the time. And then when the whole situation got towards the rebranding, we said, okay, we have this framework agnostic core. We could make a separate package out of it. You can even just use the core, right? It's available under TanStack/query core. It's a separate package on NPM. It's just JavaScript, and you can build, or TypeScript, and you can build anything on top of it if you want. And then we kind of made this whole mono repo and just bring in all the adapters under the TanStack brand to also get them more adoption for other frameworks.
And is there like a grander philosophy behind this move?
Grander philosophy. Well, maybe Tanner has something in mind that I don't know. From my perspective, I think I won't say that the library is so good that everyone should be able to use it. But I think if there's a library that the way it is built, that it's not dependent on React, why not make it available for other frameworks as well? And I'm really hoping that this will also help the adoption of other frameworks like Solid or Svelte, because when you have a community that only React has, right, in terms of the size of people that use it and in terms of packages that are available, lots of people are still driven towards React because it's what the ecosystem wants, what everybody uses, and this kind of goes in a circle. Unless other frameworks can catch up when it comes to community packages and ecosystem around it. So with the TanStack, you actually have a solid foundation when it comes to tables and queries. There's a virtualization library. Now a router is coming. So once you have all of that and you're using that in React, if you want to, there's nothing stopping you from choosing another rendering framework like Solid, and you can basically use what you're used to using in React. Same quality, same library, same mechanisms behind it, same developer experience and user experience. And I think that will maybe also give the whole JavaScript ecosystem a little boost towards maybe other frameworks, and will also drive innovation everywhere. And I think that's a good thing.
Right. Yeah, I definitely resonate with what you're saying. Just for our listeners, I'll just give a bit of a context, I think. So basically, if you haven't heard about it, there are other frameworks that are inspired by React that are starting to gain momentum. One is called Svelte and another is called Solid, which are both focused, if I'm not mistaken, on build time rather than runtime, like compiling some of the view ahead of time. So the rendering would be more efficient and more close to how the browser works. Unlike React, which is more focused on runtime, even though you could do server-side rendering and static generation, React was not built first for that, but second to it. While Svelte is more oriented to people want more minimalist runtimes for their websites. And I think for me, it still feels like not something I would use in the companies I work in, because I want very solid foundations. And that's why I gravitate more towards React, even though I really like what Svelte and Solid are doing. But I think, as Dominik said, having good foundations that are shared can really make usage of these frameworks more common. So you said a new router is coming. How's that going?
So what I wanted to quickly amend to what you just said is basically that I think there are lots of good frameworks out there, but it will probably take something that's a lot better than React to make everybody move away from React, because React is, I would say, good enough for most of the applications that you and I are probably building, right? And it's where all the ecosystem is and where all the knowledge lies as well. And this has been built up over multiple years. And everybody's familiar with React, how it works, and even all the quirks around dependencies and use effect and optimizations that you need to do, because React doesn't do them automatically for you at the moment. Where other libraries, newer libraries like Solid, that's focused on fine-grained reactivity, might even be a better fit for some of the things that we're building. But because everybody, or employers and companies, are looking for React developers, because they want to have, like you said, this good foundation, and also people they can choose from to work for them, it will take a very big shift towards other libraries that are much better than React, unless we also build a good ecosystem around other libraries. And I think that's where TanStack is hopefully helping a little bit.
Yeah, that's definitely, I can definitely understand that. Yeah, it's just like the chicken and the egg, right? And also local optimum, because as you said, it's good enough. Yeah, so I heard about TenStack through React Query. I think most people do. But you actually work on a lot of other stuff, like the table and now the router, right?
Yeah, maybe that's a bit of a misconception, because I don't work that much with other TanStack libraries. At work, we are using TenStack Table as well, and we're obviously using TenStack Query. That's how I got in in touch with Tanner and the TanStack and the Discord of his in the first place. And we're also using the virtualization library, TanStack Virtual. And I have contributed a little bit to a bunch of those repositories, but my main work is with TanStack Query. So most of the time. I'm also not that much involved with the new router. I know that it's happening and I see what's going on, and also how it's going to integrate with a data fetching approach that happens in the router. So with loaders and actions, like React Router from the Remix team has it as well. And it's the new router is basically a follow-up library to another library that Tanner has worked on before, which is React Location. It also had the concept of loaders, and we have an example where it integrates very well with React Query. But this new router is basically like the evolution of it. So also taking it framework agnostic, building adapters in all the for all the other frameworks, and a lot of TypeScript wizardry, as far as I've seen. Really cool stuff.
So yeah, maybe we should take one step back. So you're working on React Query, right? What actually drove you into the project?
Yeah. So we have to think back a bit. I think it was in mid of 2020 when we had a problem that we needed to solve at work. And I think it was about optimistic updates, even though right now I'm more of a fan of not doing optimistic updates. Back then, and also for this use case, it did make sense. I think it was some kind of reordering that we needed to do. And we didn't use React Query at the time, and we just looked at how other libraries are doing it, and we found out about React Query, and we thought, oh, this kind of the way they implement this looks neat, so we're going to try it out. And we added it basically for this one page, this one use case. And then over time, I think this was still version 1 or early version 2 of TanStack Query. And then we kind of, in this one project that we replaced more of it. We had interval refetching. We said, oh, React Query can do this as well, right? We need to poll some endpoint repeatedly. So we replaced that with it. And then we kind of got used to the developer experience and all the benefits, like, oh, I'm kind of navigating away from the route and coming back. Like, why is there a loading spinner for a couple of seconds if the API is slow? You know, other pages don't have that. Okay, let's gradually move all our API endpoints towards React Query. And the first thing that I then did was we found like a little inconvenience in the typings, because at the time, TanStack Query was still written, or React Query at the time was still written in JavaScript, and it only had type definitions. So I opened up an issue, and I think I also made a PR that kind of then fixed it. This was my first real open source contribution. And I thought, okay, it's just typings. If I get this wrong, maybe some people are annoyed that their type checker does something wrong, but I'm not ruining anything at runtime. This was kind of like a bit like making a PR that changes documentation. And then the next step for me was making a PR that changes some typings. But I was at that time like really afraid to touch anything at the runtime, because you don't want to be responsible for breaking somebody else's code. And at that time, I knew the library was already quite popular. So that's when I got into this. This was around, I think, summer of 2020. And that's also around the time when I started to start writing my blog. So in case you don't know, I do blog regularly on my blog at tkdodo.eu. About, I think, once a month or once every 3 weeks is where I'm aiming towards. Of course, a lot of content that I'm writing is about React Query, but there's also some things about React in general and TypeScript on there. And that's how I got started with open source in general. So going towards React Query, going towards my blog, writing some things for everybody to read, going out on the limb and posting that on Twitter with, I think I had maybe 20 followers or something back then, shouting into the void with probably nobody reading it. And then I joined the Discord, the TanStack Discord. And I still remember the opening message that I wrote, where I said, yeah, hi, I'm Dominik. I'm using React Query for quite a long time, and I just want to give back to the community by helping out with answering questions and stuff like that. And I think that's what I did for about 3 months, maybe even longer straight, just every day going in there answering questions, just trying to answer the questions, because I didn't have the knowledge at the beginning. So I just tried to, when somebody asked the questions, I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. Like, how would I solve this? And then I went along and, talked back and forth, started to look into the source code to try and find out if I can solve that issue, how I would solve that. And after a couple of tries, I became better at it. The question started to kind of feel familiar. So I kind of started to, okay, now I've heard this question 3 times. Maybe I should write a blog post about it. And that was when my blog started to gain some traction, when I made the first article, I think in October or November of 2020, about React Query. It was called Practical React Query, and it had a couple of tips and tricks that went beyond the docs about working with React Query, all of the questions that I've heard in the months before that. And that kind of was the first article that's been shared a lot on Twitter and also read a lot. When Tanner retweeted that article, I was like, oh my God, I never thought something like this would happen to me. And I was super happy. And from there on, this article is still read by lots of people every day. So I'm still kind of amazed by how all of this turned out to happen. Yeah.
That's crazy. So all your work by then was on your free time, right? Or was it like something you did on work, like during work, or just like, something personal, like a passion project, the blog and
so that is all of it is I do on the side as my side project. When I made the blog, I just wanted to try out and build a blog. Like, how does this work? For some reason, I don't quite remember, I chose Gatsby to do it. I'm not unhappy with it, and I'm not so unhappy that I want to rebuild my blog. I'm kind of like one of the persons that really likes to write content instead of rewrite the blog every time just to write content and then not write content. So I'm kind of like more of the writer in that sense rather than the builder for this. So I have my blog and it works okay, and I'm not touching it. I think in the time to come, but yeah, it was all in the free time. So I did it in the evenings, a couple of questions here and there on the weekend, and it took a bit of time until this became too much for me, right? So in the first half year or 1 year, things were straightforward. It didn't take a lot of time for me to answer the questions or to look into the things. I was really very active, and it was pandemic at the time. It was lockdown, so there wasn't really much else to do for me. This was also how I got into this as a hobby. I had lots of time left. All of a sudden with nowhere to go. And then I think in 2021, somewhere in March or so, Tanner made me a maintainer of React Query, which was like amazing. I never expected something like this to happen. By that time, I had also contributed some code to it, made a feature for version 3, fixed a couple of bugs, and he just said, yeah, you're doing a good job. Do you want to do more of it, basically? And by that time, then I started to do even more, and I didn't want to get overworked, because doing this, it then started to take at least a day of my work.
Wow.
And that's when I decided, because I'm self-employed, so I decided to I was working for multiple clients at the time. I decided to basically cut a paid contract to do open source instead, which might sound a bit crazy. Like, why would you do that? But for me, it was the right move to do, because it was kind of fulfilling for me to work in open source. And I introduced something that I still try to do to this day, which is the Open Source Friday. So on every Friday, I'm trying to like bundle all the things, the questions, and the contributions that I do, and I try to go over them in a fixed time block, because all those little distractions, like a quick question here and there, it started to get a bit much. Yeah.
Yeah. I can definitely see that. So now you have like a dedicated day for open source.
Yeah, I try to bundle this up into a block of a couple of hours on Friday, but I still do things in the evenings. So it's not like there's always much to do, especially when we are planning a new major version, which is something that we are currently doing. I can say that much. It's not a secret. There is trying to do everything in the open. So there is a roadmap in our GitHub discussions about version 5 of TanStack Query, and the plan is to get started with implementing it soonish. So I said personally I might have a bit of time over Christmas, in the after the holidays, a bit of time off from work where I'm going to contribute a little bit. Let's see how that goes.
That's really exciting. Is there like highlights that you would like to share, or is it still like you rather keep it in the shadows for now?
Version 5?
Yeah.
No, I can share a little bit. I just need to maybe open up the roadmap. We've had a very good discussion with all the other maintainers. So I'm not the only maintainer of TanStack Query, right? There is obviously Tanner involved, and we have other people, especially the great people that wrote the other framework adapters for Solid Query, which is Arian, and for Vue Queries, Damien, and some others as well. So we've collaborated on what we can do for version 5 to make it better. And let me just see if there are any highlights that are actually worth mentioning, because some of these things are kind of like internals where we just kind of found out that that's always the thing with the breaking changes. I think, I would personally rather do more breaking changes with small breaking things where you remove an API or deprecate it or change a little interface here and there just to streamline it or fix an edge case or something. But for some reason, most other people on the internet don't agree with frequent breaking changes. They'd rather want like one big thing that's kind of a flagship with new features and everything. So what we are going to do, and that's probably not exciting, but it's exciting for us internally, is that we are going to get rid of the syntax overloads that we have in React Query and just settle on one syntax on how to call use query and all the other hooks and all the other methods. Because when TanStack Query was made, as I said, I think it was in JavaScript, and in JavaScript it's very easy to give a function like different ways to call them depending on what the parameters are that go in there. So you can call it with one parameter that's an object, or you can call it with 2 parameters, maybe even with 3 parameters, and then you just decide at runtime what you need to do. But for TypeScript, that's a bit of a hassle with all the overloads that you need to define then, and there's also a bit of runtime overhead involved in it. So there are going to be like changes in how the syntax is with TanStack Query, and we're hopefully providing code mods for this that will migrate the syntax for you automatically. The syntax, the object syntax that we are going towards already exists, so you can already, if you want to, just use that one. We've rewritten all the docs already to recommend that syntax. We have an ESLint rule that can actually auto-fix all your changes towards that syntax. So we're trying to make the migration as smooth as possible. But this will have some big upsides, especially for Solid Query and their fine-grained reactivity that they need. And it's also going to be, good for us internally because it will get rid of, I think from use query, the hook, I think like the first 150 lines are just function overloads. And then there's like a little bit of code. So there isn't that much going on. It's just about getting TypeScript to understand what you want to do. So looking forward to really getting rid of all of this complexity.
For sure. Yeah. Overloads are really hard to maintain in TypeScript. As someone that maintains a few libraries, it's hard. So I think I'll share that internally in Flycode, we moved from Redux query to React query along the year. Took us almost a year to do the migration, just because we are a very small startup and it's not like it wasn't our top priority. It was just something that we really wanted, and it reduced like the complexity of the app significantly. But I think that as someone that worked with other mechanisms like Apollo and GraphQL and like a bunch of like other state solutions, I wonder, do you see like a future of React Query where it does more than just defining the caching, but gets like more into how like understanding automatically how to cache entities or how to so for me, for instance, it's like it still takes a lot of time to educate and work with Query Client. I'm being very specific here. Sorry if it's like very nuanced saying for the listeners, but I think everyone that's using React Query for the first like few times, it's like, wow, I can just write a function that returns a promise and I have all these, like everything data is fetching, is loading, everything is working amazingly. But then you start to work with mutations and you start to maintain cache. And that's where things, I think, get a little more frisky. So yeah, I'm just curious, how do you see the future for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also something that is asked, I wouldn't say a lot, but from time to time, it's one of the questions that comes up is around things like normalized caching, where, if you compare it to GraphQL, that obviously has the schema that is defined up front. And basically you fetch a list of to-dos and then you fetch a single to-do and you update that single entry. It already knows how to update that in the list, right? So everything is kind of linked together. And that's a good experience for developers. It's also, good for users if all of these things work automatically without having to actually refetch again. It has a trade-off of complexity. I haven't personally worked with GraphQL much or with Apollo, but one of the feedback that I get from a lot of people that migrated away from Apollo towards React Query is that the cache in React Query works in a predictable way. And there are no surprises because it is so simple. There is nothing in it that actually makes it magical. The cache internally is like an object where you have the query key as a key and the data that the promise returns on the other side, basically. And that's the two things. And everything else that you need to do then gets a bit more manual, like optimistic updates, like refetching, like updating after a mutation, especially. So when you have a to-do item and you update a single one and you want to also update it in the list, you need to actually, go to the list, update the detail entry and then go to the list and update the list entry. Or if you have multiple lists, because for example, your list kind of supports filters and every part of the filter goes into the query key, that means you'll actually have multiple duplicates of those lists in your cache because the cache is just per the key. There is no, normalization or deduplication on the cache level. We just store it multiple times because it's the easiest thing to do. And then when you want to do updates on that, you actually need to write it to every of those lists. And then you kind of get into, okay, what if this one list is sorted differently? Like, where do I put my entry and so on? And then goes this kind of complexity. And at this point, I'm always thinking like the easiest thing you can do is just invalidate, like refetch from the server. The server knows the truth, right? We are just a caching layer on the front end. We show a snapshot in time from when you have fetched the data and put it into your cache. So if you've updated it is actually a very good point to invalidate and refetch all the things that are related to to-dos or to your entity. And that's where the fuzzy query key matching comes into play, where you can say, okay, I'm just refetching everything to-do related. If you structure your keys appropriately or in a way that allows for this hierarchical structure, you will just see that all the data that you're using on the screen is automatically updated after the refetch. And then, of course, it depends on, like, are my fetches expensive? Maybe I need another caching layer on the back end. Is this really the best thing I can do? And we have thought about a bit of, defining queries up front, defining all the structures, somehow making it possible to know which queries have a relation to each other. I actually think RTK query also does a good job with this provides tag syntax, where you can say, okay, this thing is a list and this thing is a detail, and you can kind of say that the tags belong to each other, so they know a little bit about each other. But we haven't really settled on anything in that regard. So I think we've been discussing it for over a year, here and there a little bit. And at the end of the day, the pressure is not high enough. The drawback of having a simple, predictable cache that just works for everybody is not, it's not worth it at the moment for us to invest into more on that end.
Yeah, I can definitely understand the trade-off. And yeah, it's like, so I guess I can definitely understand that. And I for myself and also other people that I know, we should really educate ourselves more on how to make keys more hierarchical. Sorry, English.
Hierarchical, yeah.
Yeah, but
I think.
But yeah, I definitely understand the trade-off. Another question I had was, so you said React Query was first written in JavaScript and then moved to TypeScript. Now, I'm curious, now that it is maintained in TypeScript, are there changes possible to it that can leverage TypeScript even more than what it's currently using? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just your video is a little bit behind, I think, or maybe it's my connection.
Oh, okay.
So I only know React Query from contributions when it was in TypeScript. When I started to really contribute, it went from version 2 to version 3, and I think version 3 is the one that was really written in TypeScript. And I think I can confidently say that I would not be maintaining a library that is written in JavaScript, because there is so much internal complexity in there where I'm just so happy that we have TypeScript types. Even the things that I've written, I need to kind of offload to the TypeScript compiler to help me understand, well, like what I thought basically when I've written that. But also there are still parts in the library that I have never touched, I think, or at least just rarely touched. Mainly about, I think, server-side rendering and hydration. I haven't really looked into these parts as much. There's an experimental plugin, the broadcast query client plugin, that I haven't really looked into much. So even though I'm maintaining it for, I think, 1.5 years now, there are still areas where I haven't looked into it. But if I need to look into them, I know that we have TypeScript types and we have pretty good test coverage. And both of them together kind of give me the confidence that I'm not breaking something when I'm making a change there. So that's what it enables for me. It enables me to actually work with it.
Yeah. I just wonder now, like, are there TypeScript specific features in the user experience that maybe can be possible leveraging TypeScript even more with React Query? I'll just give an example. When I use query keys, it's kind of dynamic, right? Like I have, I don't really have validation on that. And maybe it's something that TypeScript can do with more like hacking and making the types more complex. I'm not sure. Or is there like things that you think are possible with TypeScript, maybe even as TypeScript involves, because TypeScript doesn't have all the features that it could have in the future that React Query can leverage?
So there are certainly improvements that we have made in the type area of the library. One example that comes to mind is that right now, if you execute the use query hook and you pass in a query key and a function, what you're getting back, the data is potentially undefined because it could be in loading state or it could be in error state, so you don't really know if data is available. But there is one specific case when you pass in initial data, that's data that you know when you call use query, and this is also persisted to the cache. And we actually know that when the user passes in initial data, the query can never be in loading state because you have data already. Even if you haven't fetched data yet, you have this data that you synchronously passed in as initial data. And there's actually no way that data can be undefined once you've passed in initial data, because that's kind of the fallback that will always fall back to, even if we fetch and then the fetch fails, or even if we fetch and we cancel the fetch, it always falls back then to the initial data. So we've added this to the type definitions that we're saying if someone provides initial data, we can narrow the typings so that data is always defined. You don't have to check for undefined anymore if you've passed initial data. And this is just one of the, I think developer experience things that will make it easier working with the library. But when it comes to the query client itself, this goes back to the query client not knowing which kind of data it actually holds. So there is no correlation between when you say query client.get query data or query client invalidate queries. We don't know which query keys actually exist in the library because the definition of the queries is an ad hoc definition. So there is no upfront definition like you have with GraphQL, or also like you have with RTK query, where you have an API slice in Redux where you always define everything at the beginning. And this has advantages and disadvantages, right? It's a trade-off like so many other things. I personally really like that I can scope my queries to a specific feature, or a specific team owns a specific set of things without having to go to a global definition. Of course, there are ways to get this done with Redux as well, with code splitting and splitting the API, the slices. But it's, one thing actually prefers the upfront definition, and other libraries actually prefer the ad hoc definition. And React Query is definitely the latter. And it is one of the trade-offs that this means, that we can't know which kind of queries you have. But if you are working with a TypeScript backend as well, then I would really, really encourage you to check out TRPC if you haven't heard of it. It's a library where the where the client-side adapter of it, the client-side package of it, is built on top of TanStack Query. And what it does is it basically lets you define a router in the backend in TypeScript, where you can define a couple of endpoints in the backend. It goes very well together with Next.js API endpoints, for example. And then it gives you a TRPC instance on the client that you can use and invoke to call use query or use mutation on top of it in a 100% type-safe way. So everything that you call on the front end is actually similar to just invoking a function, but that function actually lives on the back end. And it's kind of translated over the wire with use query and use mutation. So you get all of the benefits of React Query, like the automatic refetching, stale time definition, and all the great user experience that goes with it. And on top of it, you get the developer experience from tRPC and TypeScript, where you have your basically upfront router definition that lives in the backend. And then on the front end, you get 100% type-safe functions for everything that React Query also gives you, just from tRPC. And we're also using it at work now together with Next.js. And you can, because it uses TanStack Query as well, we can also use it with some other pages that don't have this yet, and they can still use the normal use query and query client methods. But the other pages that have it already, they can just use tRPC and their methods. And I can say from experience that once you're using tRPC and you start to kind of get into this, being a bit full stack developer where you do the front end part and the back end part, that's also in TypeScript. We just kind of love it. You don't want to go back.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just take a pause to share a little about the sponsor of this podcast. So the company I work in is called Flycode, and Flycode streamlines the way teams are working on software. Specifically, we started with text, and text sounds like something very obvious to have in a web app, but actually it's kind of a battleground between all the stakeholders in the company, from product to UX copywriters. Everyone kind of want to make changes to text in the product, but in many companies, the gateway to do that is to open a ticket for a developer. And we believe that developers should do more stuff like React Query and less like updating texts. So we developed two really cool technologies. One is used for managing texts that are hard-coded in the code. So if you have an app that's written in React or Vue or Angular, or many other libraries and frameworks that we support, we can actually detect the text inside the code and let your teammates to edit them and send you a pull request instead of editing, asking you to edit it yourself. And for teams that are like more corporate or more organized or just have to support a lot of languages, we also have a solution for translation management, where instead of managing the translations in outside the code, that where if you use templates or any other, like you depend on the translations, the app might fail because the translation is missing. The translations are managed in the code. That way you can be certain that you deploy a new version and everything is there. So that's just a word about like what Flycode is doing. They help us keep the lights on this podcast, which is very nice. So going back to our conversation, I'm curious. So how do you like educate yourself about software in general and libraries, and because writing a good interface is really hard, and like hitting that right spot that resonates with everyone. So how do you like learn about making better libraries and specifically the query space?
Lots of try and error, I would say. Especially, yeah, API design is difficult. So I would just take your time if you can and don't rush the decisions. I do already regret a bunch of decisions I've taken for version 4, which is probably also partially why we're doing version 5. So these things just happen, and you get better with it over time, I would say. In terms of educating, I'm trying to keep up to date with the Twitter community. So I think since I joined Twitter, there was like a time where I made the account and then didn't use it at all. And then there was a time when I started to passively consume Twitter, like follow everybody who said something meaningful, and then try to read a bunch of newsletters as well. There aren't that many that I read anymore because I see everything on Twitter anyways. One thing that I do regularly consume is This Week in React, the newsletter that I'm also seeing on Twitter every time, and I've also been in that newsletter with my blog from time to time. Yeah, and apart from that, it's mainly gotten into like lots of discussions on Twitter, discussions with other library maintainers, discussions with React maintainers, discussions with other people that maintain React Query. So it's a lot of things. I think that since I started to become active on Twitter, I've learned so much. I think this is kind of the thing that if I look back 2 years ago, I thought I was a good developer 2 years ago, but looking back now, I think I knew nothing back then. So it's always, you don't know what you don't know, what you can still learn.
And you said that you encourage people to do Open Source Friday, right?
Or no, I said that I'm doing that for myself. Yeah.
Oh, so maybe I misunderstand. So I'll ask it that way. What do you suggest people that want to get involved, want to follow your path in terms of open source and like doing things in that area?
I think the path is different for everybody because everybody has a different pace and everybody's comfortable with doing open source in a different way. For me, my path was definitely the right one for me, but I can't say that this works for everybody. What I like to do, like I said before, is go into discussions and try to help people answer questions and try to familiarize myself with the library, and then start with contributions that are not that impactful in terms of the library itself, but that are very, very impactful when it comes to helping the maintainers. And those are the documentation issues. Those are the answering discussions on GitHub discussions. So I think that, and I truly believe that every contribution to open source is valuable, no matter if it's a code contribution or not. And also raising issues or opening issues and discussing with the maintainers about issues in a way that is helpful for the maintainers, which means not opening an issue and saying, this doesn't work for me, why? Basically, but trying to come up with a reproduction that stand alone and isolated so that we can analyze the issue, or maybe even write a test case that fails with your specific scenario, right? Things like that are contributions that are very, very valuable to every maintainer. And if you want to take a look at issues directly and start jumping into the library and solving things or adding features, make sure you follow the contributions guidelines. So some libraries are open to all kinds of contributions, like here's a feature, please merge it. But other libraries always want you to open an issue or discussion first to see if we want to add this contribution, actually, if this is a good feature to add. Because just because one person wants that feature, we can't just put it in the library. There's always so many things around to consider that you can't possibly know when you're just starting out. Or even if you have contributed before, there might be things that you haven't considered or that you don't know about the library or some other usages. So always try to help the maintainers by adhering to the contributions guidelines. And then from the maintainer side, we're also trying to encourage new contributors to pick things up, trying to label issues correctly with good first issue or help wanted or something that's good to pick up. Those issues are always a good way to start if you want to get into open source.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. I think our time is up. It was really, really fun to host you on the podcast, and really excited about the new version of React Query.
Thank you. Thank you for for having me here. It was nice.
All right. Until next time. Bye.